A new league, another league start, and yes, another league starter video. One more build for you to consider during the queue for Path of Exile's Necropolis League. Today, let me try to convince you to league start the Venom Gyre Deadeye, a skill that has served me well in past leagues, such as Crucible and competitive events like Gauntlet and BPL. I personally played this build in BPL 12 to level 95 solo. But first, let's go over the build mechanics so you can gauge if you wish to league start the Venom Gyre Deadeye. Venom Gyre is an attack-based skill which throws a single blade-like projectile, which can be affected by additional projectile modifiers, one of which is Endless Munitions, which will add 2 more projectiles to our ability. The blades, upon firing, will return to the character, which will be caught and stored for a certain duration. The amount of caught blades can be seen on the top left of your screen. At quality 20, Venom Gyre will store an additional 10 blades, above the regular limit of 30, while Val Venom Gyre will instantly spawn stored blades, relieving the need to attack and catch blades. These projectiles can be released through the use of the movement skill Whirling Blades, which fires the stored blades in all directions while retaining some of the blades. The blades are fired sequentially, allowing each blade to hit a mob, allowing the ability to also shotgun, while the player whirling blades over a single target. This allows for significant single target damage, as the blades inherit the damage modifiers from the Venom Gyre skill, and not the modifiers of whirling blades. Additionally, these blades can also chain from and be affected by additional skills such as Flame Wall and Tornado. Another mechanic that will be vital to the build's single target is name locking. Name locking occurs when a player hovers their mouse over a mob and holds down a button for an ability. In this case, we will be holding down the ability Whirling Blades. As seen in the footage, this will result in the player using the ability back and forth over this target, shotgunning the mob with any stored blades. This is especially potent with Val Venom Gyre, which can be pressed in an instant to restore a large amount of blades, upkeeping the shotgun damage. Name locking will require us to disable the always attack without moving option. As mentioned, this is a tri-elemental build, which will therefore make use of the gem Trinity. Activating Trinity is a very important mechanic, which will require us to have 2 elements taking turns dealing the highest damage. The easiest way to proc Trinity is to have a large amount of elemental overlap. The example on screen shows a total overlap of 1000 to 4500 elemental damage between fire and lightning. To check if Trinity is activated, look at the resonance counter on the top left of your screen. The final mechanics of the build will be the use of Nightblade support and its subsequent buff Elusive. On screen are the effects of Nightblade support and what the Elusive buff will provide us. We will not be using this early on, as we cannot make use of the crit multi-buff and lack the required skill tree points. However, once we transition to crit, we will be using Nightblade. Now that the build's mechanics are fully understood, let's discuss the pros and cons of the build. As shown on screen, the build is a hit-based attack build, which I consider to be a pro. Though dot builds have the advantage of damage uptime, I personally prefer killing mobs instantly so that they do not have the ability to cast or attack. The playstyle is quick, as we will be attacking and using Whirling Blades to get around the map, which in itself will also kill mobs. The build has a good mix of single target damage and clear, with the Deadeye's innate chain and additional projectiles amplifying our clear, while the Whirling Blades shotgun will take care of tankier mobs. The build is all content viable, outside of deep delving, and can even do Ubers with enough investment, and is more than strong enough to obtain all 4 Void Stones on SSF gear. The build is SSF friendly and cheap, as it runs all rare gear, which can be self-crafted easily using fractures and essences. Nevertheless, the build is not without faults. It is a Deadeye build after all, and the Whirling Blades ability is technically a melee ability, leaving us vulnerable to some attacks. However, it is tankier than other range builds, and uses a multitude of defensive layers to cover for its weaknesses. However, Venom Gyre unfortunately scales poorly, as Tri-Elemental can only go so far into the end game. But for a league starter, this is more than fine, as the cost of the build will allow us to easily transition into a second build, or enable us to farm out more currency for other builds, There are some good scaling options nonetheless, which will be presented later. Lastly, some game awareness will be needed during combat, as some boss abilities will kill you mid-whirling blades. As with every league start, every player will have to make a decision on their build and the mechanics they wish to farm. On screen are some mechanics that the build excels in, and some that the build does okay in. The build has a good mix of clear and single target, therefore it is a good build to do boss rushing, invitations, and/or legion farming. However, the build is not very suitable for ultimatum, magic finding, and uber pinnacle bossing. Specifically for expedition, my build does not spec into multi-shot early, as it messes up the targeting of Venom Gyre. Therefore, early on, the build lacks the ability to prevent mobs from blocking your attacks through the attack mastery. This will hamper expedition clear. Additionally, using whirling blades into an expedition pack of monsters is very dangerous. Nonetheless, the build excels in a multitude of other mechanics, which you can decide to farm for league start. As the title suggests, our Ascendancy will be the Deadeye, which gives us speed, damage, and clear. First, we will be taking the Gathering Winds Ascendancy for speed during leveling. Subsequently, just before Kitava, we will be taking Ricochet and Endless Munitions, allowing us to transition from Spectral Helix to Venom Gyre. Lastly, for Uberlab, we will take Focal Point to boost our single target damage. As a Tri-Elemental Claw build, we will greatly benefit from the primary scalers on screen. These mods will be picked up on the tree. However, early on, we will not scale crit until we get more levels and skill points on the tree. Our secondary scalers are modifiers which will supplement our damage, but will not be as important as our primary scalers. As a Deadeye, our first and most important layer of defense is evasion and dodge chance. As such, we will want to utilize dexterity or strength and dexterity based gear, while relying on grace as our primary defensive aura. This layer of defense will be further supplemented by the elusive buff effect from Nightblade and Dread Banner, which will be linked to generosity support. Being on the right side of the tree gives us easy access to spell suppression, which will greatly reduce all incoming spell damage. Early on, we will use the Lucky Spell Suppress Mastery to pseudo-cap our suppress chance, while at later investment levels, we will cap spell suppression to 100%. The build will also be ailment immune via the Ancestral Vision Jewel, Thick-Skin Life Wheel, and boot modifiers. And as with all Deadeye builds, scaling damage will also be a defensive layer, as what is dead can't kill you. Our secondary layers of defense will be freezing enemies around us through our cold damage, while also blinding enemies on hit through the use of the tree. Finally, we will utilize the shifting of physical damage to elemental damage via the Gravicious and Corel modifiers and the Taste of Hate unique flask. On screen are modifiers which we want on our claw. Early on, crit is unnecessary, and we will focus on flat elemental damage and attack speed instead. However, when we transition to crit, we will need a crit chance suffix on the claw. The example claw on screen are some of the modifiers you should look for. Likewise, on screen are some modifiers which we want on our shield. Primarily, life, resistances, and spell suppression should be targeted early on. Later on, chaos resistance and increases to maximum resistance will be luxury mods which we want. The example on screen are some of the modifiers you should look for when picking your shield. For our helmet, initially focus on life and res. Later on, or when you unlock the craft, an open prefix will be necessary for the Corel Fizz taken as elemental craft. Moreover, listed are some of the Eldritch implicits the build would like, in order of both priority and color-coded to the respective Eldritch currency, so you can decide when to settle or to keep rolling. The example helmet on screen are what modifiers you should look for. Our chest piece will initially be life and res. Later on, look to add in spell suppression and any additional defensive rolls. Also, when you unlock the craft, an open prefix will be needed for the Gravicious Fizz taken as elemental craft. Life modifiers here are optional, as the life mastery can be taken as a substitute. Again, Eldritch implicits are listed in order of priority and color-coded to the respective Eldritch currency. The example armor on screen are what modifiers you should look for. For our gloves, initially focus on life and res. Later on, add in spell suppression, flat damage to attacks, or any other mod which can boost both offensive and defensive capabilities of the build. Again, Eldritch implicits are listed in order of priority and color-coded to the respective Eldritch currency. The example glove on screen are what modifiers you should look for. For our boots, as with the other pieces of gear, initially focus on life and res. Later on, we will want to craft our boots with essences to achieve a minimum of 30% elemental ailment avoidance to make ourselves ailment immune. Onslaught on kill and movement will be a valuable prefix craft, as we will have to give up Onslaught on kill later on in the tree. Movement speed here is not as valuable, since Elusive will give us a base movement speed of 30%, and we will mostly be traversing maps through Whirling Blades. Again, listed are some of the Eldritch implicits that we want, color-coded to the respective Eldritch currency. The example boots on screen are what modifiers you should look for. On our jewelry, we will look to fill in the gaps of the build, primarily resistances, attributes, or life. If these conditions are fulfilled, we can also throw in flat elemental damage to attacks to amplify our damage. One important thing to note here is that we will need to craft at least 2 minus mana cost to attacks, which can be done on both our rings. Doing so will require an Elrion Unveil and an open prefix. The example jewelry on screen are what modifiers you should look for. Our belt will function the same as our jewelry. You can also opt to equip a Stygian Vice and an Abyss Jewel for additional modifiers to damage or life. The 3 primary jewels we will rely on is a Lethal Pride to fix the strength requirements our build needs, the Ancestral Vision Jewel for ailment avoidance, and a Watcher's Eye with the mod Chance to Evade attacks when affected by Grace. As the league progresses, or once we obtain more currency, a better Lethal Pride and a dual or triple mod Watcher's Eye can be bought. Our cluster jewels will primarily focus on a single large cluster with the mods Wind Up, which will give us power charges, and Fan the Blades, which will give us an additional projectile. Make sure to spec into multi-shot so that Venom Gyre targeting does not break. The small mana reservation cluster jewel for Grace will give us elemental resistances and the ability to run 2 50% damage auras without the need for the mana mastery or an Enlighten. In the early game, our flask will be a Jade and Granite flask to boost both our armor and evasion. A Quartz flask will be used to supplement our chance to suppress spell damage. An Amethyst flask will be used early as Chaos resistance is hard to obtain during early Atlas progression. Later on, we will replace our Quartz flask with a Diamond flask during the crit swap. Once we obtain more currency, a Taste of Hate will replace our Amethyst flask for more defense. However, if this is too hard to obtain, you can choose instead to run the Amethyst flask. Listed on screen are some useful and cheap uniques that are easily obtainable at league start. Notably, the Rat's Nest unique helmet and the Shadows and Dust gloves will ease our transition into crit, while also giving Rampage. The Taming unique ring and Prison Weave will greatly bolster our damage while providing some resistances, but no, they do not provide any life or attributes. Equipping these items will put such pressures onto our remaining gear slots. Aziri Steps will help us cap suppression much earlier and provides a decent amount of evasion and life early on. Personally, I would recommend fitting in 1 or 2 of these unique items at league start, such as the Shadows and Dust gloves for an easier crit transition and rampage, along with the well-rolled Aziri Steps for easier spell suppression cap. However, none of these uniques are mandatory and the build will function well without them. We will now go over the path of building. In my POB, I will be hand-holding you through Acts 1 through 5, where we will be leveling with Spectral Helix. At Act 10, where we will swap to Venom Gyre after our 3 labs. To level 80, where we will play the build as a Precise Technique non-crit build. And at level 86, where we swap to crit, and provide you 2 endgame trees, where you can choose to run clusters or run without clusters. The skill section will guide you through Act 1, where we will be using Spectral Throw at the beginning, changing over to Spectral Helix for the rest of the campaign, the gems in order when we swap to Venom Gyre, the gems for the crit swap, and the mid-game tree. Well, this will be the final tree and item links we will use. Items will also be provided throughout the leveling process to help you understand which items are good and which items are bad. As you can see, these are very, very obtainable gear. Most gear is 2 to 3 mods. You can easily find better gear on the ground. I've chosen to do it this way so that you have flexibility during the leveling process and during your Atlas progression. For configurations, untick power charges until you have the wind up in cluster jewels. Set your Trinity resonance to 50 to simulate Trinity, and you can choose to untick or tick Flame Wall. If you are to turn on Flame Wall, it means you are checking your single target damage. To do so, make sure you set the count to 40 if you're using a 20 qual Venom Gyre, or to 30 if you're using a 0 qual Venom Gyre. Your full DPS will be your initial shotgun, and this is not your consistent damage throughout. Your damage will go down as you run out of blades, as the amount of blade shotgunning is reduced. Again, ticking this is completely optional. The projectile travel distance can be set to 1 to simulate shotgunning, or to set to 15 to simulate regular clear. I've set it to 1 for this purpose, just to see the full DPS. You can set your shock value, which I've left at 15, because in general you will be rolling using the Essences of Wrath or looking for high lightning damage claws, resulting in your shock value being quite high. Additionally, as you can see on the tree, there is some effect of non-damaging ailments which will be increased. This will increase the effect of your shocks. Thus, I've decided to leave it at 15. But you can change this value as you wish. The bandits are kill all, and I've left the major and minor gods up to you. For instance, these names will change in 3.24, as the different gods which belong to the different map bosses will change. Obviously, some of the things we're looking for is unaffected by burning ground if you're running red altars, and immunity to freeze early on if you manage to get it, depending on what the boss is and how early you get it. I've left the Gale Force number unchanged. You can set this to 10 if you're assuming full Gale Force. You can turn on Onslaught if you have Onslaught spec'd to the tree or on your boots. We do not gain Adrenaline, unfortunately, and I've left Killed alone. As you can see, there's many configurations for you to play with, and I've given you the options to decide what configurations you want to change, turn or turn off. One thing to note is that enemies are blinded. It's also an important configuration, as later on we were using this wheel on the tree to blind enemies. This will affect your EHP. You can find the path of building in the link in the description below. We have now come to the end of my 3.24 Path of Exile Necropolis League's Venom Gyre Deadeye League Starter. Understandably, I have released this guide ahead of patch notes, so there are a few things for you to consider. On screen are some of the nerfs and changes that we have to look out for, as Deadeye is a relatively popular Ascendancy in Infraction League. Specifically, we want to look at Deadeye specific nerfs, such as to the focal point mark effect, which will reduce single target damage, any changes to the additional projectile wheel, any nerfs to the effect of tailwind or the amount of tailwind. We can also look at specifically nerfs to gems, such as Nightblade or Sniper's Mark, although it's unlikely as Nightblade has not been played for a while now. Any Venom Gyre max blade storage nerfs, as the change from 30 to 40 blades on quality was just done in Affliction League. It is unlikely that they will roll this back, but it could always be the case. We know from the teasers that there are betrayal changes, so we have to question how we will be obtaining our unveils, such as the Gravicius, Corel, and Elrion unveils. Any changes to the uniques that you might want to use or that I've shown in the build. And lastly, we have to think about any tree changes that might do, especially in the Ranger's side of the tree, such as changes to spell suppression, life wheels, claw nodes, or any specific keystones that they might change. Although I will personally update the POB once 3.24 comes out, and I will write out in a pinned comment at the bottom of this video once patch notes have dropped any changes I see. If that is all, I will leave you guys with some gameplay. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you try out the Venom, Gyre, Deadeye for Path of Exile Necropolis League.